So I want to talk today about are we progressing as a field? So that's the basic theme. And to get this started, I'm going to play a video of Richard Feynman. So Richard Feynman's a Nobel laureate in physics. I have his book, Lectures on Physics, that was my textbook when I was a freshman. So absolutely brilliant fellow, as well as quite a character. So here is Feynman describing what science is.
Now I'm going to discuss how we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply, and then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
So that's, according to Feynman, what science is. But it's not quite that simple, because in the 50s and 60s, there were a number of philosophers of science that discussed this very question. It took Popper, in one of his books, I think this one's about 500 or 600 pages long. It's a slog. So the idea, Feynman, in his usual eloquent, did it in about 30 seconds. And but it was an important question about what is science. And I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. But let's hear from Feynman again.
Because of the success of science, there is a kind of, I think, a kind of pseudoscience that social science is an example of a science which is not a science. They don't do scientific, they follow the forms. You gather data, you do so and so forth, but they don't get any laws. They haven't found out anything. They haven't got anywhere yet. Maybe someday they will, but it's not very well developed. But what happens is,
so that's Richard Feynman on social science. So interestingly, Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos were rock stars. And I have here, just to spice it up a little bit, Jimi Hendrix, because he was from Seattle like me, a few years older, but just... These philosophers of science were rock stars. They went all over the world lecturing. But it's interesting to go back and find out why this was so important. And the goal for most of this was to discredit Marx and Freud, to say economics and psychoanalysis, psychology more generally, were not sciences. And so they had to describe what was science, what was progress, how did science make progress. So that's kind of the lens I want to use to look at where we are in psychotherapy research. So the question is, are we progressing? So in terms of theory, the sign about whether we're progressing or not is what laws do we know? So I will review what laws we know. What is it we know about psychotherapy? I'm going to give some warning signs. And of course, I'm going to give some advice to the field as well. Then I want to turn to practice and say, are we progressing in practice? Which really means, are the benefits of psychotherapy growing? Are we helping more patients now than we were in the past? And we want to look at both the individual level and the population level. So some warnings, some of the claims I will make might be upsetting to many of us. They're kind of upsetting to me. I don't mean to sound self-righteous. Most of the criticism I've participated in, full stop. So I'm not putting myself above anybody in this. As well, please consider my comments as idiosyncratic. These are my observations. You may disagree, and we could have some great discussions at the social about those disagreements. But I want to call to attention issues that I think are important to debate. So, Feynman said, what characterizes science are these laws. The laws make predictions. If the predictions are not verified in experimental work or in nature, then we give up belief in that law. So what do we know for sure about psychotherapy? So treatments work, I think, and I'll talk about this a little more in other places, but our psychotherapies help patients. It's been shown in clinical trials as well as naturalistic settings. Some may disagree, but I'll claim the evidence is absolutely strong that there are no differences among treatments. You might be able to find some exceptions for some disorders in very circumscribed cases, but in general, there's no differences. We also know therapists are important, okay? Regardless of the treatment, there's variability among therapists. Some CBT therapists are more effective than others. Dynamic therapists, emotion-focused therapists, ACT therapists, whatever you want to look at, therapists are absolutely important, and this has been shown convincingly. I think it's also safe to say relationship factors are key to the success of psychotherapy. Okay, John Norcross and Psychotherapy Relationships That Work, 3 different editions, the last one being 2 volumes. It's pretty clear. Tim Anderson's work on the facilitative interpersonal skills, among others, clearly indicate relationship factors are what make psychotherapy work. But the question is, do we act on this knowledge? Do we take these, what might be termed laws, or at least well-established facts, and turn that into increased effectiveness of the services we deliver? So you have to wait till we get to clinical progress to discuss that one. So what I'm going to do is go through a number of problems that I see in our field. Okay. So the first one is the publication problem. Okay. And this is shown by the fact we have theoretically based journals. We have cognitive behavioral journals, we have psychodynamic journals. The publications are quite different in these journals. We don't have a common understanding or a common language even to disseminate our research. So these theoretically based journals are a sign that we have a scientific problem. I'm going to contend it's not what is not published that's holding us back. In other words, there's not some big finding out there waiting to appear in our journal that's going to turn the corner. The problem is what is published. Now, I'm not going to single out psychotherapy research, but because it's our journal, I looked at this. The modal number of citations is 0. Okay, more publications have 0 citations than any other number. And the median number of citations is less than 11. So half of our publications have less than 11 citations. And I think one can publish anything somewhere, particularly if you are someone. So I once reviewed a manuscript for the American Psychologist. I found the conclusions troubling. But more than that, the method to arrive at those conclusions was biased. So I wrote a rather critical review, and I was relieved to find that the other reviewer felt exactly the same. Okay, both of us made a number of comments about issues that needed to be addressed and corrected, miscitation of the research, operations that would lead to what we considered a biased conclusion. The action editor, in the letter to the author, reiterated that. So in his opinion, this was a biased piece of scholarship. And again, we made a number of suggestions that needed to be taken into account. Well, this article, without one change, absolutely no changes, appeared in another rather prestigious journal. So again, how does that work for a science? So one of my recommendations is let's publish less, okay? More important things, but less. It's impossible to keep up on the psychotherapy literature. Well, this also leads to a citation problem. So the citation problem, oh, by the way, I couldn't resist the cartoon. The patient goes into therapy half empty, it's a glass, okay, and it comes out half full. I feel like maybe my personality is the half empty one, and that's the personality feature of this presentation is I do have a pessimistic side. But there's evidence for about any claim one wants to make. You can look through our literature and find something to support most anything you want to claim. One thing that bothers me is our citations are often goes back to the psychoanalytic or the humanistic. We cite Greenson, Borden, less often Rogers. And the reason this bothers me is not, history is important, so it's not the fact that these are historical features. What bothers me is this: psychotherapy is at its heart a social interaction. It's two people interacting, creating an effect. We know lots about human interaction from social psychology, anthropology, placebo studies, one of my favorites, sociology, neuropsychology, economics. We rarely cite the economics research, but economics is doing a remarkable job at predicting behavior, the whole field of behavioral economics. And the fact that one of our psychologists won the Nobel Prize for this very thing, okay? So psychotherapy is essentially a human interaction. Let's draw from these other domains. So an example is persuasion theory in social psychology. Jerome Frank said, he called his book Persuasion and Healing. And there is a persuasion aspect in what we do. Well, in the 60s and 70s, Stanley Strong in counseling psychology had the social influence model. And the social influence model was a very insightful an informative model to study what goes on in psychotherapy. It faded away like generals, not because it died because of evidence, like Feynman said, that showed it was wrong. It just became unpopular. Okay. When we do make references to basic science, they're often so naive. Okay. I use CBT as an example. The references in CBT to cognitions are such a naive interpretation of cognitive psychology. And yes, they've tried to up the game and make it a little more sophisticated. But basically, it's not really references in a deep way to cognitive psychology. There are some exceptions. I think attachment theory, based on parent-child interaction, is informative, and that's been used in a number of our endeavors. Research on emotion. I saw several presentations in this conference on speech vocalizations, and there we're getting into the linguistic and speech domains in a deep and important way. So there are exceptions, but I think we too often cite the psychotherapy research when we should be citing more basic science. So again, the problem is not what is cited, but what is not cited. So I like to say, and this is said somewhat tongue-in-cheek, so you can ignore this if you want, but to understand psychotherapy, don't read the psychotherapy literature. Read social psychology, anthropology, placebo studies, and so forth. Okay, the experimental pathology problem. Mental disorders as a natural kind. They are not mental disorders. Their distinctions are inventions, very good ones, but they're inventions. A number of people have written about this, so I won't talk about this in too much detail, but it causes problem for us because we base our treatments and we argue for various treatments based on these descriptions of psychological deficits that our particular treatment will remediate. And I put the word convincing there because I find them convincing. I love reading the descriptions of psychological deficits. The problem is they're not true. Okay, a number of people have written about this. Most of the descriptions of various mental disorders are not really falsifiable. So we go back to Karl Popper and falsification. But even if they were falsifiable, we have to contend with this fact that various treatments targeting various systems are equally effective. So there isn't one psychological deficit that underlies any particular mental disorder. There's little evidence for specificity of our treatments. Adherence, competence, dismantling studies rarely show any portion of variability due to the specific ingredients. So historically, there's an interesting phenomenon. Carl Rogers, Freud, the early therapists were transdiagnostic. It really didn't matter what the particular disorder was. The treatments worked. And when I argued for common factors, David Barlow said, Bruce, are you telling me that the same treatment without any modification is going to work for every disorder? Of course, that's not what I said. But there was this criticism of transdiagnostic treatments. We had to have specific treatments for specific disorders. And if you go to the Division 12 clinical psychology website of the American Psychological Association, you'll see this this matrix still there. Treatments, specific treatments for specific disorders. But what's interesting is we're coming back to this transdiagnostic idea. David Barlow himself has the unified protocol. So there, we're back to this transdiagnostic. And ACT, Stephen Hayes, Franz Leischring, psychodynamic transdiagnostic treatments. We see treatments developed for particular disorders become transdiagnostic in a sense. I mean, the idea of CBT was that depression specifically was due to dysfunctional thinking and maladaptive core schemas, okay? But now there's CBT for every disorder. Same true for dialectic behavior therapy. It becomes a more broad spectrum treatment. So it's just interesting to note the trend from transdiagnostic criticism. We need the specific treatments for specific disorders. And now we're going back again to the transdiagnostic idea. So what are the consequences if the psychological deficit is not important for successful psychotherapy? We really should be focusing elsewhere. And I think we do this, a pretty good job of this in our society. We also have a macro-micro problem. The macro, we all know this. This is nothing too startling. Macro is efficacy of treatment. This is outcome research. The micro is the moment-to-moment interaction. The problem is integrating these two. Okay. We also have a context problem. Psychotherapy is a very contextual idea. It varies by country. We see variability in outcomes by clinic. There's economic context. So the question also is, are the results generalizable? I was listening to a machine learning presentation and talking about the necessity of cross-validating. But the problem with the cross-validation, not just in the machine learning problem, is that the data for the validation comes from the same context. Okay, doesn't come from a different context. And this is a problem in the machine learning in medicine as well. What works in a clinic or a area of service in Los Angeles may not generalize to issues in Cleveland, for instance. So context is really important. So how do we integrate the macro and the micro? Well, this is mechanisms of change. We read Kasten's articles about doing this, and this is really difficult work. We think we find something that's a mechanism of change, and then we find out, well, is it specific to one kind of treatment? Change in cognitions results in decreased depression, or is that a general mechanism of change across treatments? We're not the only ones to have this macro-micro problem. I mean, Albert Einstein was miffed that he couldn't integrate general relativity and quantum mechanics. They don't fit together all that easily. And our macro and micro don't either. Okay, the construct problem. We make up things. Some things are not real. Sudden gains, reliable change. These are not real things. These are statistically defined phenomena. What's really interesting is we argue about ways to measure reliable change or sudden gains. Then there'll be an article that says, well, it depends on how you measure them. You get different answers. Well, of course, because there's nothing real there. So we may have a criteria for what's a reliable change and a clinically important change, but that doesn't mean it's meaningful to a patient. So I would also say therapist-patient agreement about anything is not real. Now, I'm not talking about the alliance, where that's a dyadic, collaborative relationship. I'm talking about measures about different things. So we measure the therapist alliance or the alliance from the therapist perspective, the alliance from the patient perspective, and see if they agree. That's not what Borden was talking about when he's talking about a collaborative effort. So these are things that I think are not real. Okay. So I talked about this. It's discovered that different methods lead to different classifications. Just uninteresting. And it's guaranteed that if it's a statistical classification, the statistical method you use will give you different answers. How many of our constructs are of this type? So we just need to think about this. So again, I can't resist giving a little advice. Let's not spend time studying things that are not real. Okay, let's continue with the construct problem. Old constructs with new names, or even multiple names. So we all know about epistemic trust, mentalization, reflective functioning, goal collaboration, expectations. CBT is a construct. It's not something that's real. It's something that we define. Okay. Behavioral activation, engagement, responsiveness, warmth, empathy, acceptance, hope, positive regard. And then I might talk about gravity as well. What is epistemic trust? How is it different than the Rogerian conditions? Okay, I think Peter Fonagy's work on epistemic trust is really important. But please tell me how it's different from the unconditional acceptance of Carl Rogers. Mentalization, reflective functioning are theory of the mind. I've read about theory of the mind for decades. Now we give it a different name. Goal collaboration, how's that different than alliance? Expectations, what happened to Bandura's self-efficacy, Jerome Frank's mastery, Irving Kirsch's response expectations? I rarely see in-depth discussions, and these are extremely important differentiations and theoretical work that would tell us about how expectations are formed in psychotherapy. CBT, what's classified as CBT? It varies from one meta-analysis to another meta-analysis. Lakatosh, who I showed in my first slide, says you really can't study something if what you're studying changes over the course of the time you're studying it. CBT, we can talk about 10 milligrams of an SSRI, and it's fairly constant from one study to another. What is CBT varies dramatically from one study to another. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Behavioral activation, well, this is a treatment that was discovered by Neil Jacobson when he did his dismantling study of cognitive therapy for depression. He took out the work on the core schema and the dysfunctional thoughts, and the behavioral activation worked just as well. So it became a treatment. And all of a sudden, we needed a theoretical underpinning for this. So Pete Lewinson, my colleague at the University of Oregon when I was there early in my career, had a theory. He was never cited in the cognitive therapy literature. But when behavioral activation needed something retroactively, Peter Lewinson was remembered. So, Pete, I know you're still alive, so it's interesting. So we also have affirmation, collaboration, goal, consensus, congruence, genuineness, real relationship, immediacy. We have to say in some clear way how these constructs are different, because we talk about what we do with so many different names. To physicists, gravity is also known as gravity. It's gravity, gravity, gravity forever. Okay, let's talk about lazy language. Empathy is observable, okay? It's expressed by the therapist and it's perceived by the patient. May not be in concert, but that's the way it is. It's a trait and a state. You can have empathic people who are generally warm, understanding, caring, and it also can be a state. So those of us who consider ourselves quite empathic might not express that when our patient challenges us and our competence. Okay. It can be entered into an analysis as a therapist variable or a patient variable. So easy to do. But empathy is different than the alliance. Alliance by its nature is a dyadic construct. It's entered as a therapist or patient variable in the way empathy might, but there's no such thing as an alliant therapist, okay? We can say that some therapists generally form a stronger alliance, but we don't know what that is in the way we know what empathy is. It's a different beast, okay? We can assess the contribution to the alliance of the therapist and the patient by entering it in at different levels in a multi-level model. But I'll claim the alliance is not observable. I know there are observer-rated measures of alliance. They correlate highly with other measures, but they're signs of an alliance. They're not the alliance. The alliance is something that the two members of the dyad sense internally. By the way, rater's not a contribution. I get criticism of this in papers that I submit, that if we want to look at the patient contribution to the alliance in a multi-level model, the patient has to rate the alliance. That's not what we read. By the way, I told you not to cite too often people going back to the psychoanalytic one, but everybody should read Borden on the alliance. There's some surprising things he said that we have forgotten. Okay, the conjecture problem. So Feynman said, we gotta guess a law. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how well liked you are, make a crucial prediction and then say what should be predicted based on that law. So I'll give you my rejection story. I submitted a meta-analysis to a journal that publishes only reviews, and it was rejected without review because we hypothesized a result. We made a prediction and we verified that prediction. And the editor said, well, no, we only publish meta-analyses that take a broad perspective and test most everything about some phenomenon. So again, the crucial prediction of theory is not well accepted in our field. We kind of say often in our papers, well, we sort of think X will happen, but it'll be interesting to see if Y happens instead. That's sloppy thinking. And we didn't find what we thought, but, and then we go on to explain it away. So what does it take to reject a conjecture in our field? So here's my favorite example. And, I really didn't want to pick out particular examples that I think are problematic, but I couldn't resist this one. So here's an article investigating the relationship between competence and patient outcome with CBT. So the idea here is that there was a training program for training CBT therapists, and they wanted to see, this is in the National Health Service in England, whether this training program would improve the competence of the therapist. And guess what? It did. There was a significant increase in scores on the CTS, okay, cognitive therapy scale. But competence was not related to outcome, the linear effect of competence. So the trainees or the beginning therapists got more, became more competent on the scale, but their effects on symptoms were not related to their competence. So in a similar pattern, the linear effect of therapists' competence on change in symptom of anxiety was found to be non-significant. It's funny how that anxiety makes it difficult to say anxiety. So summary, so far so good. These results indicate that therapist competence was not a driving factor in change in patients' symptoms of anxiety. Wow, that should be disturbing to the author, that competence in the treatment that you're studying is not related to outcome. So conclusions of the authors, this finding adds further support to the existing evidence that it's possible to train the majority of therapists from diverse backgrounds to competence in delivering CBT in a year-long training program. Hooray, you can do this. And this was the point of the study. But there was limited support was found for the hypothesis that there would be an association between CBT competence and patient outcomes. Okay, the conjecture that was made that competence was important in the delivery of CBT was not found. So let's try to explain this away. Here's how it was done. So this result may reflect limitations in generic competency measures, such as the CTSR. Okay, so, okay, we didn't find what we want, so it's gotta be the measure's fault. Even though the CTS is required in clinical trials of CBT, you have to show that the therapists were delivering their treatment in a competent way. But my favorite explanation is this one. A further explanation for the lack of association between competence and patient outcomes may be found in a definitional disparity between competence and performance. So this is the slippery slope of constructs. So now let's make a difference between competence and performance. So someone may be competent, but they don't perform competently, is the basic argument here. So what will it take to say that a law is not correct, the conjecture is false? Okay, let's look at psychotherapy as a health treatment. So psychotherapy is a legitimate treatment in many countries. That gets a thumbs up. This is due in large parts to RCTs. But have we made a deal with the devil in this? We have adopted a medical model in which treatment is king, diagnosis is the crown prince, and randomized clinical trial is the Duchess of Science. So I'll give a thumbs down for that one. This medical thinking permeates our language, thought, and practice. So I'm going to spend a little time here talking about RCTs, because RCTs in our field, I'm going to say, are a fetish. They're called the gold standard. How many times have you heard randomized clinical trials are the only way to establish causation. Well, some issues for us, they're not double-blinded. Okay, if they're necessary to establish causation, give me the cause and the effect. I don't understand what that is. We have an outcome problem, and this gets worse because we have to register our trials now and declare what is the primary outcome variable, and that's usually a symptom measure. And it could be argued that symptom measures are really just surrogate outcomes for psychological problems. Patients want better quality of life. As simple as that sounds. Often in randomized clinical trials, the models are wrong because therapists aren't modeled. And if you don't model therapists, it creates bias in your outcomes. And we have all the accoutrements of medical trials, risk of bias. And often we use a measure developed for medical trials, which is absurd in psychotherapy because we're not double-blinded. None of our trials has anywhere near zero risk of bias. We talk about adverse events and so forth. The replication problem. How many of our comparative trials have been replicated? So Nick Frost and another one of my former students examined the largest effects for such comparisons. And none of those large effects had any direct attempts. And to have a direct attempt, you had to treat the same disorder with the same treatment manual. Even then, the conceptual attempts to replicate were few and far between, and they didn't replicate the results. So the replication problem that plagues all of science plagues us particularly. Okay, let's look a little more at randomized clinical trials as a fetish. So here's a wonderful article, Understanding and Misunderstanding Randomized Controlled Trials. Nancy Cartwright, I spent a day at a small seminar, 5 or 6 people, extremely smart person, but you know, she's not a big fan of clinical trials and really believes in qualitative research. So I was a little skeptical about this. Angus Deaton is an economist, so I asked my friend Ian Coxhead, who's an economist at the University of Wisconsin and sails with me. I said, what about this guy, Angus Deaton? Well, Bruce, he is a Nobel laureate in economics, so I think he knows what he's talking about. So fabulous article. And the main thing that they really talk about is context. We can think of it as generalizability, but the context of a clinical trial is administered in is so important. You can't just take these economic clinical trials or medical clinical trials and export them without thinking of the contextual effects. So RCTs is a fetish. What have we learned from psychotherapy RCTs? They work better in the waitlist control group. All treatments are about equally effective. But actually, we kind of ignore this one because many systems of care mandate particular treatments. Okay. What else have we learned from clinical trials, I ask? So I did a little research here. I put in PsycInfo. As a method, it had to be randomized clinical trials, had to have trials in the title. Even then, there were 13,000 of these. Let's price them out at 200,000 per trial. 2.6 billion US dollars to determine that psychotherapy works and that all psychotherapies work about equally. Wow, that's a lot of money. Common factors are discounted often, by some of our colleagues because they're not established in randomized clinical trials. We're told over and over again, correlation does not mean causation. Well, if you read the placebo literature, they've manipulated a variety of relationship aspects and show that the effects of placebos are affected greatly by the relationship. It's a great model for testing experimentally this. Yet those same people that discount common factors because they're not established in randomized clinical trials interpret multi-level coefficients from randomized clinical trials, meta-regression coefficients, and those are cited as strong evidence for this and that because somehow, somewhere in there is a randomized clinical trial. Statistical methods. Let me just talk a little bit about this. I have mixed feelings about this. As you know, I'm trained in mathematics. I like statistics, but there's a danger in complex methods. They're not focused. Oh, so often, how many coefficients are tested? 20, 30 different coefficients. So this idea of focused statistical tests is talked about in the statistical literature. Focus one coefficient on the conjecture that's made. Now you might have some other coefficients to rule out some of these ancillary hypotheses. I'm finding that the methods are not reviewable. I'm asked to review multi-level models. I cannot tell what was done. And so they get more and more complicated. Let's not use these methods in place of thinking. The thinking is the important part. Thinking about the conjecture, but thinking about which methods will actually best take or best test the conjecture. Often the models are simply wrong. And I'm not going to talk about this too much detail, but I've read several studies and I've reviewed them predicting the final outcome from early progress. Early progress is absolutely necessary for a better final outcome. Well, the models that were tested don't take into account that the patient actually made early gains. So if you look at two graphs of the stock market, early gains in the top picture, well, of course they're going to have better outcomes at the end because they've already made gains. So the question is, what are the gains conditioned on the early gains? So factoring out the early gains, does that predict future gains? And here I've taken an example where it doesn't. Basically, the stock market is a random walk. So yeah, you can predict what the stock market will do in December if you knew what it did in April. So make sure you test the right models. My recommendations is use multiple programs. Make sure your results are in agreement with simpler methods. So the simpler methods are not the best way to test it, but you can test some things to see the trends. Outliers, anomalies, know your data. So have we progressed scientifically? Well, I'm not going to answer that. You know, I've seen some tremendous presentations in our conference. We are progressing, but let's think of the problems we're facing. So in the last 7 or 8 minutes, I'll talk about clinical progress. Okay. So have we made clinical progress? Yes. Psychotherapy is paid for governments, agencies, insurance, and much more available than it was 40, 50 years ago, okay, when it had to be paid for out of pocket. So we've made progress that way. We've made progress because psychotherapy is relatively short-term and focused now. I didn't know my family. My father grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, but he moved to Seattle after he went to law school when he went to check on his wild sister at the request of his parents. and didn't go back. But I met my Uncle Al at my aunt's funeral, and he had just retired from the state of Alabama. And I said, Uncle Al, what's the best thing about retirement? I don't have health insurance. And I go, well, how could that be the best thing then? I don't have to go to psychoanalysis anymore. It's not paid for. So we no longer go 3 times a week for the lifespan. Okay, so that's good. What that's the affirmative. What's the no answer to this? And the no is, oh, it's paid for by governments, agencies, and insurance, because these bodies control what we do. Okay, and often they tell us how long treatment can last. So the short term and focus has been used against us because it's mandated 6 sessions for a major depressive disorder, for instance. So we had famous therapists, Carl Rogers, Irving Yalom, Milton Erickson, and so on. I got to see and know Lee McCullough, brilliant therapist. These are therapists from the past. Are our current therapists more skilled than these therapists? I ask you. Let's look at the evidence. The effects of cognitive behavioral therapy are decreasing over time. There have been some rejoinders to this, but as far as I can tell, it's not increasing, very definitely. So some would say that, well, you know, the original CBT therapists were trained as therapists, psychoanalytic therapists or humanistic therapists. And now CBT therapists are trained with a manual. It's one hypothesis. Therapists are not improving over the course of their career. So here's a study of therapists over the course of their career, and their effects are getting smaller over time. That's disturbing. So clinical progress. Innovations, we've made routine outcome measurement, machine learning, telemental health services, internet treatments, bots, apps. I think these are innovations. We'll see, routine outcome measurement in trials shows some outcome. It's very hard to implement in clinical practice. Question is, will innovation come from the private sector? There's Zach Immel's Listen, which uses machine learning to analyze therapy sessions. I'm involved in TheraView, which is a deliberate practice platform, and there are others as well. Sometimes private sector is where innovations will come from, because it's part of the entrepreneurial substrate. But we are in a risk of being a commodity. People buy behavioral health and they try to deliver it in the least costly way possible. So that's a problem. Psychotropic medication, of course, being prescribed by primary care physicians is a real threat to our field. Clinical progress, what are the problems we face? You know, the biggest problem we have is access. We know psychotherapy works. It's very difficult for many people to access psychotherapy or psychiatric services. Second biggest problem we face, access. Third biggest, access. We don't talk about this, okay? 99% of our efforts are in the individual level, 1% on the population level. I made that up. I think that's close. We ignore therapist effects in our, generally in our clinical applications. Data from Michael Barkham and the National Health Services. We have some demonstrably above average therapists and demonstrably below average therapists. What do we do with that information to improve the quality of care. I think I'll not say too much more about that. So I showed these slides to a number of people before I gave them, and they said, Bruce, you can't end on a note just talking about problems in the field. You need to give a positive, uplifting message. And again, remember, I'm the glass of water walking in half empty. So here's my attempt at half full. So one is the future belongs to you. And by you, I particularly mean the young people in our field. There's some tremendous efforts being made, and it's inspiring. So I am encouraged when I see some of the work that's being done. But we need to learn something. We have to test conjectures. We can't just add more information, more information. As Feynman said, we have the trappings of science. We collect information or data. We subject it to statistical test. We act as if our conclusions mean something. So we're putting in conclusion after conclusion after conclusion into our corpus of results. But we need some laws. And we need to do something. We really have to do a better job of taking what we know about psychotherapy and making it both more effective and making it more accessible. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I want to say thank you to SPR. You know, over the course of my career, SPR has been home, and it's just a wonderful place. We do good work, and we treat each other with wonderful kindness and support. So thank you, the audience, and thank you, SPR. And I think we're going to have a social hour such as it is. So I will sign off and say again, thank you.
Okay, don't go away yet, Bruce.
No, I'm not going away.
Good. Okay.
Wow. You won't get rid of me.
No, don't go. Don't go. So I just want to say, wow. I'm blown away by just an incredibly brilliant and thought-provoking and also very entertaining presentation. So thank you. You know, you describe yourself as a pessimist. And if a pessimist is somebody who lists all the things that we're doing wrong, okay, I'll agree with you. You are a pessimist. At the same time, it seems that's not a bad thing, that there's some benefits to being a pessimist, because I know personally, I felt incredibly inspired by your talk and just observing the comments in the chat as you were speaking. I think you had the impact of inspiring many other people. So I thank you for that. I also want to say that, you know, one of the things that's always struck me about you, Bruce, is that I see you as a real Renaissance man. And you have this wonderful, genuine competence in so many areas that just makes it a delight to listen to you. You know, you've done this brilliant job of acknowledging various influences that we should be thinking about more: basic science, and from Feynman, physicists, and economics, and rock stars, and so many areas that we should be thinking more broadly about, and how they influence our field. And I also think you've always shown this really healthy respect, but also just deep understanding of various therapies and a tremendous ability to consume and synthesize diverse and very rich field of psychotherapy research. I also find it a real delight to listen to you talk about statistics and talk about the complexities of stats and also critique stats here, but make it all sound extremely simple and coherent. So I appreciate that about you. I'm sure everyone will agree that it was just a delight listening to you today. So thank you very much for your talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelley.
So I see Henning has joined us, and I know we've come to the conclusion of our conference, and at this point, we just want to conclude with a few words. I want to share, and sure Henning may want to share something. I want to offer just a few reflections and maybe lessons that I've learned. First off, this has been our first virtual conference. And I think one of the things that we've all learned is that actually we can change, we can adapt, we can change to this new reality. And I think I, like everybody, really longs to see each other in person. I feel sad that we couldn't do that this year or last year. At the same time, I think that, that there clearly are benefits to being able to engage digitally. I know that across the conference, we've heard from many presenters that have been exploring the benefits of technology and psychotherapy, and in particular, one of those benefits helping us increase our reach in terms of who can receive psychotherapy. And this is especially important, as Bruce highlights, since we're not doing very well in terms of being able to reach out to many people who may benefit from therapy. Clearly, face-to-face therapy has many advantages, and combining it with virtual approaches can be a real strength. I think we've also heard from many presentations across the meeting the past couple of days that have highlighted the importance of when psychotherapy is tailored to individuals' cultures and to transdiagnostic features, we can really enhance the effectiveness of our therapies. We've also had the benefit of hearing from many presenters about the value of sophisticated statistical methods and learning more about how to study very complex field of psychotherapy. And in the case of personalizing, I think it's also been really important to hear, and Bruce has highlighted in his talk, very diverse opinions about methodological approaches to advancing personalized therapy. From those of you who've been advocating that we need to go more deeply into studying micro processes, and others, actually such as John Norcross, who made a strong case for studying at a macro level and using RCTs. And I think it's a really important tension. Bruce, you talked about this, the macro and micro level tension of small data and big data, and likely embracing a dialectical path where we can find some synthesis to different ways of knowing maybe our best path forward. Before we end our meeting and transition to our social meetup, and I know, Henning, you've got a few words to say, I would like to say my thanks first to Henning Schallenberg and also Johannes, one who've been a complete pleasure to work with you. It's always been extremely easy to work with all of you and your team. So the whole local organizing team, along with the scientific program committee that I've been working with, for being an incredibly committed group of people who also have brilliant ideas. So I appreciate you for your input. I want to thank Bernadette Walter and Martin Gross-Holford for their support throughout this meeting, as well as our technical team led by Oliver Evers, Claudia Diaz-Martin, Ryan Kavanaugh, and Lauren Natt, who were involved in the technical and administrative aspects, as well as all of the many students and who've really contributed to making this happen. knowledge sharing is an important part of what we do, and part of our annual pilgrimage to these meetings. Knowledge sharing, but also collaborations and making friendships with people. The event doesn't stop here. You have opportunity to access recordings over the next year. We will, we're already anticipating that we'll be including a virtual component to future meetings. So we are going to be very interested in your feedback on this event so we can better understand how to serve your needs. So I will stop there and say thank you to everybody and turn things over to Henning to say a few words.
Thank you, Shelley. Yes, some final words from my side as your host this year. Well, what an event we had the last 3 days. And I feel quite overwhelmed that everything went technically well. We couldn't be so sure before the conference. And so, well, of course, I join you to thank all the people you already mentioned. And I want to thank all the participants for their huge positive feedback for us as the local team, which was felt good to hear. And also for your patience for some of the minor difficulties. But personally, I want to repeat one thank of you, Shelley. That is the thank to Oliver Ehlers and his team, because they let me sleep well in these days. And he was, as many of you don't know, he was the troubleshooter in the background, and he was busy. I don't know if 24 hours, I hope not. And also I want to thank all the young colleagues who helped us as technicians in the panels and who helped us over our I call it tech fright, which is a worthy successor of stage fright today. And it was really a pleasure to see them, watch them working calmly and competently to help all the presenters. So, of course, thanks to all the presenters and to all the listeners. I hope that every one of you found, as it is in my experience always the case in SPR meetings, found a nugget to take home. And I also hope you can enjoy to even dig longer over the year, since we have this unique situation to be able to have access to all the presentations. And I think we will use them. We may use these presentations in our own teaching and training institutions. I'm not sure if this is allowed, but I would propose because, yeah, I found some nuggets. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say from my side. And now it's a pleasure for me to invite you to our social event, which is not the Heidelberg Castle, but it will be fun, I'm sure. We will meet in 45 minutes or so in the spatial chat, and you can join there, and you will realize that we will have some rooms there with some games and quizzes, and we even will have some introductory music performance, and everything else will be told to you at the event. And I hope many of you will join us and join all the colleagues, and the spatial chat already over the days, and it's really a good chance to meet and to talk and to end this conference together. So I hope to see you in whatever way next year in Denver or in Rome, and thank you.